everybody. Welcome to Improv FAQ at Length. This is a series of longer conversations about improv topics that have lots of questions surrounding them. I'm James Quesada.
And I'm Bob Wick.
And we have a very special guest joining us. It is Mark Kendall. Welcome, Mark.
Yay!
Hey.
How's it going? So,
what's up, John?
thanks so much for being here, Mark.
Yes.
We've kind of been doing a sort of sub-series with our show here called a Show and Tell series. And that's what we're going to be talking with you about, where in a Show and Tell series, we talk about a show that we've been a part of and worked on and the things that we learned from it and have grown from it along the way. And you have a show called The Magic Negro and Other Blackness. Is that the official title? It's gone through a couple title changes, right?
Yeah. So it's like when I travel with it, it usually has the name The Magic Negro and Other Blackness just for like brevity.
Yeah.
And then there's a theater in town here where I did it a couple years ago, and it had a longer title. So that was The Magic Negro and Other Blackness, is told by an African-American man who also happens to be black.
Which I have a penchant for long titles too. So that's actually my preference. But
yeah.
But so it's a show that it's your solo show that you've worked with for a long time, something like 5 or 6 years, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a really great show. Bob and I had a chance to see it when you came up, and you've gone on tour with it. So you came up to the Michigan area, and I think you hit all the theaters in our comedy community, including Go Comedy, where Bob and I saw it. And it's gone through all sorts of cool progressions since then. And so we were hoping to talk to you about the evolution of that show and your experience with it and everything that comes along with it. So for starters, can you give us your short description of what that show is, how you describe it to people when they ask about it?
Of course. The Magic Negro and Other Blackness, the way I break it down is it's a one-person sketch show where I examine the representation of black men in the media. And hosting the show is the Magic Negro archetype. And so usually when you see the Magic Negro in movies, they tend to be an older black man, maybe with supernatural powers, that guides the white protagonist through the film. Mm-hmm. And so I use that archetype to guide the audience through the sketch show. So what you're kind of seeing is the Magic Negro interacting with audience members, as well as me playing off of maybe common stereotypes or depictions that are gone to a lot for black men in TV and movies. And then I kind of, that's kind of like the sandbox that I'm playing in. And then as the show goes on, I myself am introduced as a character. Mm-hmm. And towards the end of the show, I kind of express my feelings about what it feels or what it means to do comedy as a black performer specifically. So that's kind of the whole show.
Yeah, and it's just in terms of like the form of it, it's a really nice mixed bag of those characters that are talking directly to the audience. You have audience interaction, and you have kind of, sketches where we're playing multiple characters and bouncing around with the fourth wall still up, and like you said, also including yourself as a character or a voice in the show. It's so well written, it's so great, and
it's such a tight show. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. You sent us. I got to watch it again, so I was really happy. Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool.
It was so great.
Yeah. And so, can we get a little bit of the story behind how it came to be and the early stages of developing it?
Of course. Yeah. So I'll tell you the whole story. I perform. I'm an ensemble member at Dad's Garage Theater, which is an improv theater in Atlanta. When I tell people about Dad's Garage, the thing that I think makes it a little different from most other improv theaters around the country is that in addition to being an improv theater that does shows every weekend, back when there were shows, they are also simultaneously a theater company. So they put out a season of theater every year. But rather than solely doing like works written by other people, so like Shakespeare or, well-known musicals, the vast majority of the plays that are done are new original works written by the improvisers that are in-house. So Dad's Garage is unique in that it gives a lot of playwrights their first chance to be produced, where, at least I can only speak for Atlanta, and Atlanta is tough to be produced just in general, and so as a playwright.
Wow.
And so, and so the way we decide what to produce is every year we have what's called season planning. I don't know why I put it in quotes. That's what it's called.
It's a half quote.
Yeah, it's called season planning. And so that's where the whole company, so performers, volunteers, staff members, if you have any connection to the theater, you show up on an afternoon and people just pitch their ideas. And so that's how I was able to get it produced at Dad's Garage. Can
I ask you about that real quick, just as a little side note, because I think that's such a cool process of deciding as a community what to produce. Some friends of ours went down and visited Atlanta and Dad's Garage and came back with that idea. And I just thought it was so cool. And so I'm just curious about how it works, because you said that like everybody kind of comes together for like a town hall where you can pitch ideas. And then is it the same openness that everybody votes on what gets produced, or is it's still a panel but smaller, or what?
So as long as you show up and you stay for all the pitches, you're allowed to vote. And
wow.
And so awesome. The votes, as I understand it, are like part of the consideration. So meaning if you go and you pitch something and it scores high enough, it has to be considered to be produced. Now, there are other factors that come into it. So it's just like they still have to put together a season each year that makes sense, So if like 8 people were to pitch, a Christmas show, they may not be able to do 8 Christmas shows the next year. But the idea is that if you pitch an idea that scores high enough, usually the theater will work with you to get it to a point where it maybe can be produced. Now, like any other theater, there are other factors that get considered when they decide what to ultimately put on stage. Right. But it's pretty fair. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you pitched it, how far along did you just have a basic idea or a structure, or did you have some scenes written, or was it all completed and just here we go?
Yeah. It was a while ago. I can't quite remember. I think I'd say that I probably had like, maybe 10 minutes of strong material and ideas for the rest of it. So it was still in the early stages for sure.
Okay. So but you didn't have like even like a draft of a script. It was more like concepts and.
Yeah, I had like a couple completed sketches. In fact, the video that I'm releasing tomorrow is where I read Green Eggs and Ham, but I switch out some words. That's what I pitched. So like for my pitch, I just did that piece. And so it was like, this is the tone. This is what it'll be like. Yeah.
I love the voice you do for that one. It's just like it sells it. It sells it so hard. Yeah. It gives the contrast. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's going to be great.
Yeah. So you make the pitch and it becomes one of the produced works for the year. And so what was it like going through the rest of the process, taking just the few concepts you had and then building out the rest? Did it come pretty quickly, or did it take a lot of like consideration of how to approach everything that you wanted to cover in the show?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a process. So it was a lot that kind of went into it. So I think there were a couple elements. So one, there's a show that used to happen in Atlanta that doesn't exist anymore called Dottie. And it was basically a solo comedy showcase. And the only rule, you could do whatever you want. It's just that it had to be solo performance, but it couldn't be stand-up and it couldn't be improv. So it would, and also like most of the time it was people doing new stuff. And the crowd was great. So it was a good place for me to test out like what kind of things I was comfortable with as a solo performer. Because prior to doing the show, most of the work that I had done was mostly improv and a little bit of stand-up, but I hadn't really done as much solo sketch in front of an audience. So I would do that show Dottie every month and try different like mechanisms or like techniques each month. Like, oh, what if I used music this week? What if I did crowd work this week? What if I played several characters this week? And it wasn't necessarily that I was doing material that would ultimately end up in the show. but I was exploring like different ways that I might perform. So doing that as I wrote the script was invaluable because it also just gave me confidence as a performer. The other thing that I did too was that I consulted with people from my life to really kind of like nail down the right tone. So it's just like, how are you speaking bluntly and directly about race relations without necessarily feeling like the audience is attacked, yet also at the same time not trying to shy away from things. And that's not something that I feel like I've ever really, I think you're constantly doing that as a comedian. I don't think that process is ever done. But I think that I was able to meet with a couple of people early on. So I had a theater professor, her name is Sandra Richards, and I showed her like an early draft of the script. And her feedback really helped me retool it. I think it would have gone in a different direction without her suggestions. I also had an improv teacher in IO Chicago named Barry Height. And he also gave me a lot of great pointers as well. And then like the big part, the thing that made it like a show was the rehearsal process that I had through Dad. So I had like 3 weeks to a month of rehearsal. And Megan Leahy is an ensemble member at Dad's Garage, and she was the director for the first iteration of the show. And basically, we would just kind of get together every day, her and Haley Brotherton, the stage manager, and I would just kind of like do stuff again and again and again for them. And that kind of like ironed out the tone and the pace and all those things. So for that first iteration of the show, those were the primary elements that made it what it was.
Okay, so and then some of you had a little bit of building up a sensibility between you and direct interaction with the audience from doing a little bit of stand-up. And so like and then when you said that your professor like helped you kind of turn into a different tone, was that about like the overall, just the tone, just the treatment of everything, or is it about like what kind of content to include? Because originally like just sorry to pile on, but I just thought it was interesting that you said that the Green Eggs and Hams sketch was the first one, because that doesn't really have anything to do with cinema culture and the Magic Negro concept. So I'm just kind of curious if early conversations also made it more and more about pop culture representation and stereotypes.
Sure, yeah. You know, that's a great point about it not being directly related to, you know, movies. I guess in my mind it's sort of like the treatment of Blackness in our culture. So maybe that's another way to put it. So it's just like the way that the N-word is handled, you know what I'm saying? Like in our culture, the way that it's televised or filmed, you know? But in reference to, or in response rather to my professor, I think that some of the earlier drafts that I had of some pieces maybe hit hard stuff without properly building and releasing tension. So, and I can't really remember our talks exactly, but she said that so I don't remember what she said, but basically my takeaway from it is, from my talks with her and my talks with my old improv teacher, Barry, was just like, be intentional about how you choose to raise and release tension so that it is not like uneven in terms of how you are expressing discomfort or jokes, so that it doesn't come across as pure anger or like not taking things seriously. And so just kind of being deliberate about like what you're introducing and when. And that balance is something that like I still am exploring, not just with that show, but with other pieces, you know?
Yeah.
Because then it kind of brings up questions about like, well, I mean, who do you want to feel discomfort, when, and why? Because we all have different thresholds. So it's kind of like, but that's kind of like almost a different thing. But yeah.
Yeah. So, and then once you start, okay, so you have your initial run of it at Dad's Garage. And then at what point do you have the thought of like, let me take this on the road, and like, what was it like to prepare for that, in both adapting it for what you can't really carry with you, and also for the like figuring out how you're going to reach different audiences, or again, like kind of just taking notes along the way of what's working and adding in new stuff, or if you were doing that.
Certainly. So while I was doing the show at Dad's Garage, I also applied for a grant at a theater in town here called the Alliance Theater. And they have a grant program called the Riser Artist Lab, and it's funded by a family in Atlanta called the Rise, and their last name are the Risers. And so each year this theater gives 3 projects, like a year to year and a half, to develop. So you get rehearsal space, you get use of their, you can get feedback from their staff. They also give you money to like develop the piece. And so at Dad's Garage, I ran the show for about a month. So I had the chance to do the show a bunch of times, and that gave me a lot of information about what was working and what was not. And then I started the lab program, where I got to continue to work with Megan Leahy, who was the director of the show, as well as Linnea Fry, who was the marketing director at Dad's Garage. And she kind of came on as a producer, as well as another voice in the room, because she's also an excellent comedian, Megan and Linnea both. And at the Alliance, there was essentially, she was a dramaturg for us. Her name's Jessica Holt. She's a theater director, but she was in residence at the Alliance when I was doing my grant. And so we would just meet up and try to develop the piece. And in addition to trying to push the show further, we also adapted it. So the show from the beginning was always very stripped down, because I always knew I wanted to travel with it.
Oh, okay.
But then it was just like, okay, but now let me really strip it down so that I can keep everything in my backpack if I need to. And so that was honestly just trial and error, honestly. So like I had a tape, started submitting to festivals, and just started doing them. And each time I would learn a little bit about like what worked and what didn't work. And then through the Riser Artist Lab program, it was cool because I got to do closed performances as well as public performances to get more feedback. So, for like a good year and some change, I would just be doing festivals, performances, in-house, out of town. And just from doing it again and again, it's not so much that you're making like these huge changes, but more so you're getting confident in what does or doesn't work, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I wasn't really so much the type of person that would be like, I do a show and then like completely rewrite it. It's more so like I do a show and be like, yeah, that still works in this region of the country. And then, it still works in this region of the country. And then a couple months go by and you do it a lot. And then you're like, oh, you know what? And this joke should actually be that, And so it just kind of slowly evolved. And then towards the end of my time with the Riser Lab, the Alliance Theater said like, oh, we like the show and we'd like to give it like a full regional production. So the Alliance is, has a little bit more money than Dad's Garage. And we want to like build a set. So you've been touring it, but we want to do like a full production with like a big old set and props and all that kind of stuff. And sorry if I'm rambling a little too much.
No.
And so, okay, cool. And so then, so with that one, that was a way more souped up production. And so for that one, Anthony LeBlanc directed that version of the show. And Anthony just recently was named new executive producer of the Second City. But at the time, he was a director at the Second City. And so it was really great to work with him. And so some ways that the show kind of evolved further was his direction, as well as bringing in a composer from the Second City that he had worked on that kind of upped the soundtrack of the show. Having a full set changed a lot. We also had a projectionist that came in from out of town. And so all these things made it a more immersive experience, like a theatrical experience, as opposed to
modern theatrical too. A projectionist,
right? Yeah,
getting light in there.
So it was like, it was a different experience rather than, and not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's a different experience than just me kind of standing in a black box. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
With like 10 simple cues, and I don't necessarily like prefer one version over the next. It's just, two different versions. So
what about in terms of like a learning experience? Do you feel
Sure.
you did a bunch of shows in Atlanta? and then a bunch, because I know you said you were doing festivals, but like when you came to Go Comedy, you were just traveling in and visiting. It seemed like you were just making your way all over. So like, from getting to take the show to travel versus like doing as many shows in one spot with one community, where are you learning more about like the show and yourself and like the community and the audience impact? Sure.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, overall, shows didn't vary that much from city to city. I think that's probably maybe what I learned the most. But there were some things that made a difference, you know? So if you're at an improv comedy festival, the audience is going to skew a little younger. And so that reaction is going to be different if you're in like an old theater that's been around for decades. The audience is going to be decades older, and the reception to the pieces is going to be different. So it's like if you're in front of a young audience, obviously, and you play the Migos, that means something to them, versus like an older audience that may not have heard them. They may not catch the reference. Some other things that make a difference would be like the makeup of the crowd. So if you go to places like Detroit, Atlanta, especially, you know, certain nights you might be performing for like a majority Black audience, and that can change the tone of the show. But if you're doing it for all white audiences, especially after Trump got elected, honestly, reactions were different, you know, like, nothing like outwardly hostile, but it's just like things changed the more I've done the piece.
Yeah, I bet, man.
Yeah. And so, one kind of funny thing, funny, not funny. So like I was, one of the places I took the show was the Edmonton Fringe Festival, which was a really cool experience. Edmonton, don't know if you've been, but they have the largest Fringe Festival in North America. And so you got all these shows, and the city of Edmonton kind of shuts down for a couple weeks, and the town is taken over by this huge theater festival. And they're great audiences, but like hardly any Black people. It was so weird. Like, I think that experience was so strange because I don't think I've seen so few Black people like in my life for that period of time. And it was just odd. The reason I say all that is in the version of the show that I did in Canada, the first night I was there, I did a version of the show where I pretend to like have this breakdown and act like I can't continue the show. It's a part of the act where one moment you're not really sure if it's real or not. And then by the end, you're pretty sure that, you know, that was a performance. Mm-hmm. The reason I bring this up is at the Fringe, like the way you sell tickets, the way you make money is like word of mouth and good reviews. So it's like if you don't have really good reviews, it makes it harder to sell tickets, and then it can go from being a money-making thing to something where you lose money. So the person that was in the audience reviewing me that first night didn't understand what was happening.
Oh, no.
And in her review, she thought
Kendall
that she thought I had a meltdown and tried to recover the show, but couldn't really.
Because you do that part right in the middle of you almost set up a bit and then you do that part from what I remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
And so fortunately it worked out where it's just like the show had good word of mouth. I marketed the show really hard. So I was able to sell tickets, but there were experiences like that where I would go to a town or a city where like certain broader aspects of the comedy they'd understand, but some of the more nuanced aspects of the show, either they didn't quite get or they just weren't used to having those conversations in that city. So like, I don't know how Atlanta compares to the rest of the world. It's just, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't really know what it's like, but I know that it's not unheard of to like have conversations about race on stage. But I'd go to some other cities where it just wasn't as common, you know, and responses, you'd see that in how they respond.
Do you talk with people in city to city, whether for festivals or just visiting, when you're touring with it by yourself, do you get to have meaningful conversations more often than not, or is it sometimes just kind of like, well, the show went good or bad, and then it's like, night, everyone, I got to move on?
Sometimes they're meaningful. Honestly, with that show, it's a little weird. Like, most of the time, people don't really have much to say to me afterwards. I mean, it's not a lot of conversations. Usually, if there is a long conversation, I'm not trying to be mean. Honestly, the times that I've been, like, held up after the show talking to someone at length is usually, like, a white person telling me some obscure story about, like, a time that they thought they saw racism. Like, so it's not.
Oh no.
So not like a very productive conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
And now, I mean, I'm not trying to say that that's not productive for them. I'm just saying, for me, I wouldn't get a lot out of those conversations.
Sure.
I mean, sometimes, like, you might travel and you'd meet other Black performers that maybe could relate to, like, what you were exploring in the piece, and some good stuff definitely came out of that. But I don't know if it's like a positive or a negative, but it's just like, I think there wouldn't be too many conversations.
It's tough. I mean, it's like you really lay a lot out there in the show, so to like rehash it, or to just kind of like, especially if you are playing to majority white audience, to come up and then, I don't know, I just feel like it would be a tough thing to approach a performer about too, is just be like, hey, can I give you some of my baggage, or like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of, I mean, like, I have done runs at places where, like, I'm getting the years kind of run together, but I think maybe last year or the year before last or something, I did a run at the Cleveland Playhouse for the New Ground Play Festival, where it's like new playwrights show up and you do like a weekend of shows. And so I remember for that one, we did Q&As after every show. And, sometimes good stuff comes out of it, sometimes not.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, so about that moment in the show where you set up, like, is it always Beyonce goes to a slave plantation is like the setup?
So sometimes yes and sometimes no. Okay. So, like, the first version of the show didn't have it. Sometimes when I would tour, it would have it. Sometimes it wouldn't have it. So it's like, I guess the most recent iteration of the show where I left off with it. Yes, that's there.
Yeah. But it's like, here's maybe not heavy handed isn't the right term, but like, here's a name of a sketch that makes you go, how's he going to pull this off? Is that typically what you're using? Is like something that kind of makes get people in that spot so that they're like kind of tense for about how you're going to approach whatever's going to happen?
Yeah. So, like, at the time when I mentioned Beyonce at a slave plantation, I also underscored it with one of her songs that was popular at the time. That was also exploring. There was also exploring race relations, and so there was also like a small conversation being had about what she was trying to say or what she wasn't saying, and just something as extreme. And so I was trying to kind of mash together a bunch of things so the audience would understand why maybe I would be uncomfortable about doing that sketch. Gotcha. So it's just like, so there's like Beyonce in that particular song, putting her in a slave plantation, also me playing Beyonce, and just if I've set up the show where I'm talking about exploring Black men in comedy, there's also like the history of Black men performing as women in comedy sketches, and so just kind of throwing in all these things, not really saying anything about them in the sketch, but just throwing all these elements out there so that an audience member might been like, oh, that's a lot to think about. Yeah. And if he's kind of like getting uncomfortable at this moment, I kind of get it. So that's the reason why it's titled that. So
totally.
So yeah, there are several parts during the show you bring audience members onto the stage. I always love that, but with this show, like Did you have? I mean, was there a process of learning, like, because you take care of these people so well and talk about difficult things, and I think it's so educational what you're doing and entertaining, and it's amazing. And I can see how it could also be hard at some points, because sometimes you can stare at an audience member all day, but they're not leaving that chair. But also, like, just making them comfortable enough to have this it's kind of like a metaphor for conversations that we should be having, and you really take care of them. So, I mean, how has that been?
Yeah, mostly positive. I think, and that kind of comes from like the improv background, where you learn about who is good to pick as an audience volunteer and who is not. So you want to pick someone that may seem hesitant, but of course definitely wants to be on stage. So if anytime someone doesn't want to get on stage, I'm not going to push them, so it's like, so if someone doesn't want to get on stage, just like move on quick, and yeah, I think like once both them and the audience understand that you're trying to make them look good, you're fine, and then the only time you would really run into issues is, if the audience volunteer is trying to be funny or they inebriated, thing like those.
I was going to ask you if that was ever a thing that you had to put up with, or, especially with the material you're dealing with, like,
people being cheeky
when you do the Q&As and stuff like that, like, yeah.
Nothing's really been like so bad. Like for me personally, I think sometimes people have said some things that made themselves look bad. I did a show once in North Carolina, and there's a point at the end of the show where I bring up an audience member and I kind of like do an icebreaker conversation with them. And the question that I asked is slavery, like yay or nay. And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, do you think slavery is good or bad? Like slavery, good or bad? Yes or no? And maybe they thought I was trying to like catch them or like get them to say something. I don't know why, but they said their answer was that there are many different types of slavery, as opposed to saying like yes or no. And and I think that that's probably like that may be like the most unusual thing that someone said like out loud. And I think there's a lot of things that prevent weird people actually making it on stage, because I mean, it's just like I'm able to see if they're into it or not. Also, the show is called The Magic Negro and Other Blackness. So, if you come to that show, you probably have an inkling of what's going to go down, so yeah.
Yeah. And kind of on that note and going back to the quote unquote meltdown moment, part of what you express in that you kind of like, you're like, let's stop, let's bring up the lights. And there's two main things that, and let me know how accurate I am in reiterating these, Mark. But one thing is that you say is that you're going out of your way to make people comfortable in the audience, and especially the white members of the audience, because it's all dealing with race. And there's this question or worry that you bring up about, like, especially using comedy, that you're making people feel comfortable about topics and subject matter that really don't bring you any comfort. And there's another point in there in terms of using comedy where you're like, you're worrying that you might be contributing to stereotypes in your character work, and that a lot of stereotypes come from comedy and film and in television and in theater, and that you might be adding new stereotypes while you're addressing others. So I guess I'm wondering, like, that's written into your show, and it's kind of like, again, you peeling back the curtain to have this conversation with yourself, or dilemma with yourself. But like, where is your head at now? This far past the show, we're moving on to the next thing about like the role of comedy and those questions that you raise in that moment of the show.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that I still kind of just question all the time, you know? So it's like, so I'll give you some examples. So it's like, you know, I come from improv. My background is improv. So when I first traveled with the show, I'd be going to a bunch of improv theaters. And so most improv theaters, like, their audience is almost always majority white, unless like sometimes maybe more people would come knowing that like, oh, there's going to be a Black show that's going to be there. And so sometimes like there might be like a slightly different turnout, but more often than not, like audiences would be very white. And so those audiences are going to have like a certain threshold. So, you know, something that I've been thinking about recently is like, you know, their comfort level is going to be what it is. And so either I'm going to write stuff that makes them laugh, or I'm going to write stuff that may not make them feel so comfortable all the time, but I know it actually is not that bad. It's just you're not used to having those conversations yet. And so then it brings up questions. It's like, oh, well, maybe like improv theaters aren't really like the best place right now for like the type of content like that I want to make if I want to go somewhere and get a lot of laughs. You know what I mean? Like,
oh, sure. Yeah. Are you trying to like, really push people's comfort zones versus like really bring a piece of like entertainment that's hitting its mark?
It's not even about pushing comfort zones, honestly. I mean, I guess it kind of is. It's more so about like really kind of getting to the heart of certain issues on race, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're someone that is still not even sure that race or racism really exists, your capacity to like understand certain arguments is going to be limited, you know? And so it's just like, I don't know if that's really like who I want to be writing comedy for. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But like, if that's the majority of the audiences that show up at improv theaters, that might not be the right space for me to explore solo work, you know?
Sure.
And it's not that I would never do shows there again. I still do shows in improv theaters, but it's more so just asking where I'm at right now. Mm-hmm. It's kind of asking questions about like, you know, who am I writing for? What spaces does it make sense to write in, you know? Things like that, you know? I mean, and it's not like it's new, right? I mean, when I would travel with the Magic Negro show, there'd be certain jokes where the audience would go like, oh, but it would be a release for Black audience members.
Yeah.
You know? So it's like, but I think you can kind of get into trouble when you're trying to make sure, like I said in the show, if you're trying to make sure that everyone laughs all the time, because then the people that maybe give a little bit more thought to this in their day-to-day lives, maybe you never really show them anything new, you know, like if they come to this show. And so for me, it's just kind of like, well, what would I want to see? You know, like, I don't think I need to see much more comedy for me personally. I'm not talking about comedy in general. I'm just talking about the stuff that I would like to make. I don't want to make too much more stuff where it's just like racism is bad. And then you don't really say anything other than that. You know what I'm saying? It's like, we know it's there. We know it's so it's just like, but do you have anything else to maybe say about it? And not even necessarily solutions, but it's just like different feelings that you want to explore about it. So, So, and it's not like I feel bad about the stuff that is in the show right now. Like I said, I'm releasing the Green Eggs and Ham sketch tomorrow, and I've updated it. It's a little different. But yeah, I realize this is kind of rambling, but as far as like where I'm at,
it's a great, all really, really great points for consideration, especially in terms of like the growth of an artist in general. Like, subject matter aside, you're going to get to points where you've said what you need to say and it's time to move on to the next thing to say. And in terms of a venue too, I mean, like in the improv community, again, regardless of what type of show you're doing, it's still like its own audience and community and culture, and it's tough to kind of bridge the gap between like the show and then go pitch it to like a legit theater when you're like, oh, is this like improv and sketch, you know? is like the expected response, like so I totally hear what you're saying, and I think it's a really those are really, really valuable points to hear in the thought of developing as an artist.
Yeah.
So what are you looking to do next? We talked a little bit before this, and you let me know that the show, you're probably retiring in its form as a live show, but you're pulling things out of it for digital content. And then, so tell me about where that process is at, and other things that you're working on right now.
Sure. Yeah. So, been trying to work on doing more video stuff, primarily because, like, live performance is not a thing right now, at least not in the way that I'm not performing live right now.
Right.
And even before that, I'd wanted to kind of create more of a catalog of video stuff so that, for people that can't see me live, they still have an idea of the type of comedian I am. And so I did a couple weeks ago, I released a video piece about public transportation in Atlanta, which is from the show. And then tomorrow I'm releasing another Magic Negro piece from the show. And so I'm trying to do a mix of like sketches that I've had, just hanging around live that I want to do on video, as well as new stuff as well. So that's like kind of like the video stuff that I'd like to try to do.
Cool.
In addition to that, I've been working on a new solo show for, a year-ish or so. It's called Diversity Now. And the idea is that it's me leading a diversity inclusion seminar to new Black hires at a company. And the idea behind it is that a lot of times when, and who knows if these conversations are going to be changing now, just given all this going on in the world, but about a year ago, let's say, a lot of times when a company or any group of people would say, we want to get better with diversity and inclusion, usually what that meant was going at the pace of what the white people in that company felt comfortable with, as opposed to what actually helped serve the underrepresented groups in the company. And so that's how you kind of have like those conversations where, you have this diversity and inclusion seminar or something like that. We meet for hours. And at the end, as far as we get is racism is bad,
Right.
And then the Black people in that space have to do a lot of emotional labor of making everybody feel okay, right? And so the idea behind Diversity Now is like, well, what if I gave like this fictional diversity and inclusion seminar that was for like Black people and like was for them and went at their pace. And so it's a little bit kind of taking away from where I left off with Magic Negro a little bit in that sense and trying to explore what that looks like. And so I did like a couple readings last year and put it up on its feet a little bit, but it's still trying to work on it, still trying to figure that out. But that's the premise of the new show.
I love it.
Incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really enjoy your writing because you always come from a place of truth, and just a lot of your comedies is, I don't know. I guess just coming from a place of truth and just being honest. Watching your show earlier, I think the link you sent us was like 2 or 3 years old, and a lot of the stuff you brought up still exists, and it's timely. Like because I was watching it like in my living room, it could have been the news, and it was just it is crazy, man. Like, but I think it's so important what you're doing, and and thank you, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, I'm excited for this show because I just think what you're doing is so fucking cool. And yeah, thanks, man.
Yeah, I love that MARTA sketch, by the way, and I think that it's because the premise is about public transportation going from like inner city out to like the fringes into the suburbs, and whether that's going to lead to Black crime venturing out. I know that we've had that conversation in Detroit. I would imagine that it happens in all that overlap community in every city that has public transit, and how far it should go out, and the ridiculous consequences.
Yeah. Why is your fear ridiculous? You know?
Yeah. So it's funny. It's like because you're being so specific to the Atlanta community, but you could just replace words and county names, and it's the same thing in so many other places. So that's great. We will include a link to that sketch in this episode, as well as the one that comes out, which the Green Eggs and Ham one should be coming out the same day that this episode is released. And then what else are you doing? You're doing some teaching right now, is that right?
Yeah. So Kickstand Comedy in Portland, Oregon. They reached out to me to teach a BIPOC class. So what's going to happen is it's going to be online. It's going to be virtual. It's an 8-week introduction to improv class that I'll be teaching. And the thing that's cool about this is it's free to the students. So, but there is an application process. So you apply to take the class. Priority is given to students in the Portland area because they're trying to build up that community. But they will reserve some spots for people that don't live in Portland because it'll be a virtual class. And I'm trying to spread the word about it just because I really appreciate what Kickstand is doing and trying to, create this opportunity for these improvisers in their community. But also, I feel like the more people sign up, the more they'll see there is a demand for this kind of thing. And they already want to do it, but it's just like the more I feel people choose to sign up, the more they'll see like, oh, it's good that we were doing this, and encourage them to continue with it. So yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah. I think that that's amazing. So Kickstand is based in Portland, is what you said, right?
It's in Portland. Yeah,
they are. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's just the model of that of just having like using the opportunity of the pandemic right now, where for all the shittiness that's going on, that you're also opening new doors for like the virtual realm and being able to connect communities and resources in these really great ways. That's an awesome example of how to be innovative with that medium. So very, very good on them, and good on you. Okay, Mark, is there anything else that you wanted to plug or let us know that you're working on? I mean, that's a lot. You're doing a ton, man.
Yeah.
I have to say, you can follow my comedian page on Facebook if you just search for Mark Kendall. It'll have my face. I'm on Instagram as well. I just joined Instagram really recently.
Congratulations, cool.
All right.
Yeah, so at Mark Kendall Comedy is my Instagram handle. So if you want to follow me on social media, and I'll be posting my videos there. I'm not doing any live shows right now, but when I go back to that, whenever that is, I'll post about it there too.
Okay, awesome. Thanks again, Mark. This has been a really awesome conversation. Glad to know that you're healthy and safe, and look forward to all the things that you're working on. And we'll hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, man.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, great to see y'all.
And thanks to everyone for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on Improv FAQ at Length. Bye.
Bye.